Shabbat Shalom. Now that we've spent some time together, let's talk. I'd like to share some words of Torah, some things that I've been thinking about and reflecting on over the course of this week. I'm going to move this challah because I'm just going to put it right here. We'll come back to that, don't worry. Last week was just my second Shabbat here at Congregation Beth Israel. I thought that I would have spent it here in this space, getting to know the service outlines, bonding with the new clergy team. But thanks for the laugh. But instead, last week, I had a different assignment. While I missed being here with all of you, I also loved getting to enjoy my first Shabbat at Camp Stein. I'm sure many of you have had the chance to experience the magic. Not only is it 20 degrees cooler, much appreciated by this recent Californian, but also it rains every day of second session in these sudden and grandiose downpours that end as quickly as they began. Tefillah, or services, take place under a majestic circle of tall trees, and smiling kids are everywhere, looking straight into each other's eyes instead of down at their screens. Summer camp is really as magical as they say. And as a rabbi, it is tempting to say that this magic is rooted in Torah, in the experience of being Jewish together and creating holy space. And it is, in part, but there's more to it. Let me tell you about my time at camp. As a first-timer to Stein, I felt like I could have used a manual for all of the traditions and inside jokes. For example, at the end of lunch, after all the plates had been cleared and the dishes cleaned, the campers, counselors, everyone were suddenly on their feet, dancing, all in sync. Another example, during a good old-fashioned camp song session, the whole group, all 300-something campers and staff, inexplicably started to sing about someone named Danny Barrow. Maybe some of you know him. I didn't. Apparently, he was a staff member who's long since moved on to other endeavors. And another one. On Shabbat morning, while all the counselors slept in, the campers were treated to donuts, distributed through an elaborate retrieval and rationing system that they all somehow understood. There's a lot about camp that just doesn't make sense unless you are fully immersed. And once you are, all of those little rituals, the chants and the dances and the games, they take on a meaning all their own. Camp Stein, though ours, is also a culture of its own with a history unto itself. And as an outsider who can't wait to be an insider, I asked a lot of questions. And in response, I heard a lot of stories. Danny Barrow, that guy whose name is invoked during song session, I heard at least 3 different versions explaining who he is, why his name is in the song, how old he is, and what he's doing now. Danny, are you here? No answer. This, my friends, is what we call lore. Camps have it, families have it, and even the Torah has it. This week's Torah portion begins the book of Deuteronomy, or Devarim, the 5th and final book of the Torah. Here in Devarim, which literally means words, Moses begins to recall the Israelite lore, to retell their story. Moses knows that his long journey is coming to an end. His successor has recently been assigned, and God is standing firm on the decision not to allow Moses into the promised land. And so Moses turns towards his people and begins to tell his stories. Kehilah Kedoshah, our parsha begins. These are the words that Moses spoke to all Israel. We are the people of the book, the people of the stories that we tell again and again and again. So speaking of camp, you've all played telephone before, right? You know that game where you sit in a circle with your cabin or your class or your group, and one person whispers a sentence into the next one's ear, and it gets repeated and repeated until it comes back around to the beginning, and undoubtedly the words that remain are hilariously different from the original set. Kehilah Kedoshah. These are the words, unless, of course, it's an entirely different set of words. A close reader might wonder if they are catching Moses in a game of telephone, as he goes on to tell his story in Parshat Devarim. Somehow it seems that many of the details have changed from the first time we read these accounts back in the book of Numbers. While the major plot points are the same, when Moses retells the story of the Israelite journey to this next generation of Israelite people, it's not like rewatching a favorite scene from a beloved movie that gets quoted again and again. Rather, Parshat Devarim is more like watching the movie version of a book you've already read. It's similar, but with some significant editorial changes. It's complicated and a little bit tricky to talk about the changing nature of truth in these tense times, especially before we've really gotten to know each other. But tonight I'll offer that perhaps there are times when the evolving nature of the stories that we tell about our history can sometimes teach us more about ourselves than the truth as it happens. The lore that we share, the stories that we tell about the way we remember our experiences, they are a part of the lesson too. Take, for example, the lore that surrounds the tradition of putting an orange on the Seder plate. Has anyone here ever put an orange on a Seder plate? Has anyone here never heard of putting an orange on the Seder plate? Well, it would make sense if you had never heard of it. It is a relatively new tradition, if we consider that Seder plates have been around since the early hundreds, and we've only been putting oranges on them maybe starting in the 1980s. So the first story I heard a few decades ago was that the tradition of putting an orange on the Seder plate began when some rabbi somewhere declared that a woman belongs on the bima like an orange belongs on the Seder plate. So lo and behold, from that day forward, oranges began showing up on Seder plates as rapidly as kids line up for Shabbat morning donuts at Camp Stein. The movement was a proud one and not much disputed in progressive circles, particularly as more and more girls learned to chant Torah, more and more women found their way to adult Benot Mitzvah, and female rabbis and cantors became more commonplace. So, how does the meaning change when in 2003, Dr. Susanna Heschel, feminist writer, scholar, and professor, explained that this wasn't the way the story happened at all? She described this is a hard sentence. She described the origin of the orange as a tradition she began to symbolize the fruitfulness for all Jews when lesbians and gay men are contributing and active members of Jewish life. It's a totally different story. It has a totally different meaning. Do these different versions give less power to the orange? Does giving voice to one marginalized community take away from another? I wonder if the story that we were ready to hear in the 1980s is different than the story we were ready to hear decades later. The ritual remains the same, but our hearts have opened to new experiences, new lessons. The story had power when it was understood to teach us about the role of women in Jewish life. The story has another power, a new power, when it teaches us about LGBT inclusivity, and we grow with each retelling. Perhaps Moses in his final discourse is not changing history, but rather acknowledging the progress of the present. His changing story is not a reflection of who the Israelites were, but a nod to who the Israelites are becoming. Kehilah Kedoshah, these are the words that Moses spoke to Israel, and in doing so, these stories became ours to tell. At camp, each generation will learn the cheers and the dances and tell the stories in a way that makes camp theirs. And while I'm curious to know what the real Danny Barrow is actually up to, I also love that at camp, kids are making up their own version. This is the magic, a new world that is created by weaving together the long-held ties of sacred camp tradition. Our stories are made of both roots and leaves, stretching upwards and onwards, even as we tell them in a chapel shaded by its branches. Kehilah Kedoshah, these are the words of our tradition, and they are ours to share and make new as we try to make sense of our lives today. We begin with a story, and its meaning is ours to tell. Shabbat Shalom.